Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to have a look at a Bach chorale, and we're going to examine what's going on in these first two phrases of the chorale, and in particular just focus on the aspect of fluid bass lines. So we'll come back to that shortly. So in this particular chorale, you might look at this and wonder what the key is because there's no key signature. That's not uncommon with Bach chorales and music of the Baroque in general, that you end up thinking, I'm sure there should be this key signature, but there's either no key signature or there's a different key signature. Things weren't always quite as defined then as they later came to be. And I think if you were writing this in a more modern era, you'd probably give it a D minor key signature of 1 flat. So that's just a sort of general background in case you're looking at it thinking, is this in C major or something? No, it's not. Anyway, before we talk about it, let's hear these first two phrases of this Bach chorale. It's number 210 in the Riemenschneider collection. So these two phrases demonstrate many features of the Bach chorale style, and we'll have a look at them. But immediately you'll notice how there's an awful lot of movement in the bass, and we'll see how that's generated in due course. First of all, let's just locate ourselves with keys. So as we were saying, we're basically in the key of D minor, even though there's not a B flat in the key signature. And you might look at the first phrase and think, well, there are no B flats in the first phrase. Well, actually, when you look at the first phrase, there aren't any Bs. Had there been Bs, they probably would have been B flat. So a little bit of musical detective work required there, but it's the cadence that really says, we're in D minor. You've got C sharp in the alto at this point, where you can sort of see that that's really indicating a dominant chord in the key of D minor. And it starts with a tonic chord in D minor at the beginning. So that's really locating our key. And then the second phrase is all in the key of A minor. You notice we've got this G sharp here. It starts with an A minor chord at the beginning of the second phrase. And then we have this cadence in A minor that goes 5 followed by 1. So very clear-cut key structure despite this key signature issue. Okay, now then, let's think about what's happening harmonically and think about how Bach generates this fluid bass line. You see, the bass line is more mobile than any other part in this chorale, which is something that he often likes to do. Not always, but often does. So we've an anacrusic start. In other words, we're not starting on the first beat of the bar, and we've got chord 1 in D minor. Now what's happening next? On the second half of that beat, where you've got this G and E downstairs, these are double passing notes. Okay, double passing notes, they're just notes that don't belong to that D minor chord, but they're just passing by step onto the next chord. So chord 1 in D minor, double passing notes. Then we've got chord 1 again. Notice, even though we've got the same chord again, it's now in a different inversion. It's now moved into first inversion. And for those of you who are trying to harmonize chorales in the style of Bach, maybe because you need to for some kind of music exam, which is often a requirement, what do you do in this sort of situation where you're thinking, I'm going to end up with the same chord for an anacrusic start as I am for the first beat of the next bar? If that's the case, well, try shifting inversion. So this is what Bach does. He starts on chord 1 in root position, and then he goes on to chord 1 in first inversion. Now, this E in the bass is an unaccented passing note. So we're already getting the idea. How does Bach make this bass line mobile? He doesn't do it by jumping around to different notes of the chord. You know, if you're going to be busy in a bass line, you could just be going up and down a D minor chord. That would keep you busy, wouldn't it? But if you want it to be a little smoother, a bit more scale-like, as Bach often does, then the only way you can really do that is to use auxiliary notes or neighbour tones, or passing notes or passing tones, depending on which terminology you use for that. So here you've got an unaccented passing note. Unaccented because it comes between the beats. But it's also interesting what happens next, because the next note in the bass is an accented passing note. Okay, let's just sort this out. So here we've got chord 1 in first inversion. Here we've got chord 5 in first inversion. So the basic chord is 1 in first inversion and then 5 in first inversion. So he could have just done that. But how does he make this bass line mobile? The kind of basic thesis of this video. He does it by putting in passing notes. So we have 1 in first inversion, we have a passing note, then we have a passing note before we resolve the bass onto a note that belongs to chord 5 in first inversion. So now you might be thinking, is this possible? What I'm saying is we've got 2 passing notes next door to each other. How can that be? Because surely you have a note that belongs to the chord, a harmony note or a chord tone, then you have a passing note or a passing tone, and then you have another note next door to it that belongs to the chord. Remember, passing notes have to pass by step from where they've been and where they're traveling to. So if they're doing that, surely you have to have a harmony note or a chord tone, a passing note, and then another harmony note or chord tone. Well, there's one place where you can have 2 passing notes next door to each other. So these 2 notes are both passing notes, but you can only have 2 next door to each other if one is unaccented and the other is accented. So remember the difference. Unaccented means they come between the beats. Accented means they come on the beat. So we've got a harmony note or a chord tone with F, a harmony note or a chord tone with C sharp. This note is a passing note that's unaccented next door to a passing note that's accented. And you also hear the difference between the unaccented and the accented passing note, because the accented is much stronger. You know, you hear the unaccented, it sort of passes by, but the accented is really dissonant, isn't it? You think, crikey, is this really Bach? You know, if I just played you this chord, you wouldn't think, oh yes, I'm listening to Bach. But when it moves on to resolution, onto the C sharp, it's rather gorgeous, isn't it? So there we are, passing notes or passing tones, accented and unaccented, how you can have 2 next door to each other, how all of this use of these passing notes is giving us a mobile bass line that's moving along quicker than the other parts and is moving by step. Okay, so that's a useful technique to know about if it's new to you, whether you're writing in the Bach Chorale style or thinking, actually, that's a way in which I could mobilize my bass lines when I'm writing in whatever style you want to write in. Okay, let's see what's going on next, because when we come on to this chord, we're back at chord 1 again. So we've got this next, which is rather gorgeous, isn't it? Now let's see what's going on. Here we've got chord 1. This is a passing note, an unaccented passing note. When we get here, this is still chord 1, but it's now chord 1 in first inversion. And then in order to keep the bass moving, all he does is hop back to the root. So remember earlier I was saying you can do movement in the bass by having these passing notes or auxiliary notes, but you can just hop around the chord a bit. And that's what he's doing right at the end of that bar, hopping from first inversion to root position. So this E in the bass is an unaccented passing note because it's coming between the beats and it's moving by step from the note before and by step to the note after. That's important if it's going to be a passing note. Now there's one other thing that's going on here. You might be looking at this note in the alto thinking, well, why is there an E there? Because if this is chord 1 in D minor, that's D, F, A. What's E doing there? So E is a dissonance. And in fact, what's going on is we have a suspension in the alto. So if we look at these three notes in the alto, remember a suspension has to be prepared, sounded, resolved. So it's going to be prepared here, sounded there, resolved there. That's how that one works. It's prepared here because that E belongs to this chord, that chord 5. When you go from P to S, the note should stay the same. Must stay the same, in fact. So it's doing that. But when you're sounding S, the suspension, that note will be dissonant with the chord. Well, it is. When it resolves, it's going to resolve by step, normally downwards, which is what it does. And this note of resolution must belong to its chord, which it does, because all of this is a chord 1. So a suspension, 3 steps: prepare, sound, resolve, but you only have 2 chords. That's an important thing. So prepare belongs to one chord, resolve belongs to the second chord, suspend, that's the note that's dissonant with the second chord. But P and S, same note, S to R, by step, normally downwards. And we call this suspension a 9/8. All right, so that's a 9/8 suspension, and we call it that because we reference it above the bass line. So this E is a 9th above this D. And when I call it a 9/8 suspension, I'm not describing P, the preparation, I'm describing S and R, the suspension and the resolution. Now, for those of you who are into figured bass, there's one little thing to notice here. This is a 9/8 suspension above that D. Because the bass has moved from root position to first inversion, if you were writing this as a figured bass, you would write this 9/6. Why would it be 9/6? You know, if it's a 9/8 suspension, why call it 9/6? Simply because the resolution is 6 above the bass note, and it's because the bass notes move. So it's a 9/8 suspension, but because the bass has moved from root position to first inversion, if it were to be figured in figured bass, you would see 9-6. That often causes confusion. Anyway, you can see what's going on there. And now we're arriving at this cadence where basically it's going 1 to 5 in D minor, an imperfect cadence. Okay, so what happens in the next phrase? Well, when we look at this bit, one thing that's sort of quite interesting to spot is that this corner here is sequential with this corner there. Do you see that? We had a D and an E in the melody there. Now we've got an A and a B in the melody here. So it's a fifth higher than it was, isn't it? So effectively, the harmony has been transposed up a fifth. It's been relocated. If you think of the bass line from here going up a fifth, but then down an octave, you can see what I mean. And a little bit of reorganization of the inner parts, but it's basically a rerun of that. So now we're in the key of A minor. It's starting with 1 in first inversion, going to 1 in root position. So here it comes. We've got 1 in A minor in first inversion, unaccented passing note, and then here we go again, accented passing note, onto chord 5 in first inversion. Okay, one other thing to note at this point. Between the end of this first phrase and the start of the second phrase, we finished on this A major chord here, chord 5 in the key of D minor. Then we move straight on to this A minor chord. And some of you might be thinking, well, where's the pivot chord? Where is the chord through which we pass that enables the modulation? In other words, you know how a pivot chord works. It's a chord that belongs to the key you're leaving and to the key that you're joining. And you might have thought, well, in the key of D minor, if I was going from D minor to A minor, why wouldn't I use the tonic chord of D minor as a pivot chord? Because it would be a nice one, wouldn't it? D minor is 1 in D minor, it's 4 in A minor. Well, Don't forget, Bach is rather stuck with the chorales he was given, so he has to manage all that. But sometimes Bach doesn't use a pivot chord. Shock horror. If he's not going to use a pivot chord, it's nearly always between the end of one phrase and the start of the next. So he's kind of done a clear-cut move here. He's finished in D minor and then he's started in A minor. So if he's not going to use a pivot chord, that's the most likely time when that's going to happen. So that's a good example of that. Interesting that in a way, there's a little rule being broken. False relations, C sharp there, C natural there. So if you have a note in one part in one octave that appears in a different part in a different octave on the following chord, but with a different accidental, that's a false relation. So he's got a false relation here, but is he bothered that he's got a false relation? Is he bothered that he hasn't got a pivot chord? Absolutely not, because he's finished one phrase and now he's starting the next. So that sort of mops up a few things. But the main thing here is to spot this mobile bass line again, that sequential use of the earlier passage with an unaccented passing note followed immediately by an accented passing note. Okay, so let's move on. Where are we going next? Well, at the beginning of this bar, we've got an A minor tonic chord, and the bass is simply moving up to the first inversion. So how does he keep the bass mobile? In this case, simply by moving from root position to a first inversion. Okay, now this is an interesting corner because here we have a chord 4 in its first inversion. But what do we think is happening next when we look at this movement here? Now, there are two ways of looking at this, and it's often the case in a Bach chorale actually. You can look at that C in the given top part and say that's an unaccented passing note. It's just passing by step between D and B. So that's an unaccented passing note. You could say the same of the tenor. That's an unaccented passing note moving between D and F. So it's just an unaccented note in between. You can say the same of the bass. This E is an unaccented passing note, just moving between the F and the D. So you could look at this whole situation. I mean, the A is a continuous harmony note, by the way, but you could look at this whole situation and say all of those three notes are unaccented passing notes. So triple unaccented passing notes. That's all true. It's also true to say that this is a chord of its own because it's an A minor chord in second inversion. So I've gone from chord 4 in first inversion to an A minor chord 1 in second inversion on my way to a 2-7B, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, why would I have a 1C there? That's a bit odd, isn't it? It could be something that's not unrelated to a passing 6/4 because I can go from a 4 in first inversion to a 1 in second inversion onto a 4. That would count as a passing 6/4, wouldn't it? But in this case, 4 and 2-7 are not far removed from each other. If that's chord 4, all I've got to do is stick a B under it, and it's now 2-7B. So when I come to this chord, I'm using 2-7B. So in a way, this functions harmonically as a passing 6/4, if you follow that argument. So how do we know? Is it triple unaccented passing notes, or is it a chord in its own right, 1C? And if it is, why are we using 1C there? Because it sort of is a passing 6/4. It's slightly unusual to have a chord changing from that quaver to that quaver. It's fast harmonic rhythm. But I think all we can say is that all those things are true. And it often happens with Bach, and it's one of the great genius things about Bach, is you can look at something through one window and you can also look at the same thing through another window and say both these things are true. So do they sound to you like triple passing notes? They kind of do, don't they? But at the same time, there's a harmonic function going on there. All this is helping mobility in the bass line, because we can make those two bass notes happen, can't we? Whether we regard this as a passing note or as something to do with the harmony. So that's what's going on there. And then we get 2-7B very typical of Bach in the chorale. 2/7 in first inversion. Notice the bass, to keep moving, is just hopping down to its root there. Then we're going to a dominant chord, and then very typically Bach starts on the dominant chord, he adds the 7th, so it becomes a dominant 7th using this passing note in the tenor, just there. And then that takes us on to our resolution, onto chord 1. Quick point about the resolution of a 5/7 chord, the dominant 7th. Remember, when you resolve a dominant 7th, the 7th falls by a step, the 3rd rises by a step. Well, the 7th is in the tenor, that falls by a step. The 3rd is in the alto, so it should rise to A, but it doesn't. It falls to E. Why does that happen? Here's the one exception to what I've just said. 7th falls by step, the 3rd rises by step, unless the 3rd rising by step will create a triple root. Now that's what will happen. If that G sharp goes up by step, we'll get 2 A's there and we'll have an A in the bass. That's a triple root. So it strengthens the chord if in that instance, the 3rd of this chord falls to the 5th of the tonic chord that follows. And then you'll get a stronger final chord instead of having a slightly weak chord with 3 roots and probably no 5th. So a lot going on in just those 2 phrases, but the main purpose here is to see what's going on, but also to see how this fluid bass line is constructed, how that actually works. Okay, let's put it all together again, and this is what it sounds like. They're absolute gems, aren't they, these chorales? So I hope you've enjoyed unpacking that particular pair of phrases. And if you have enjoyed this video, well, you might be interested in having a look at www.mmcourses.co.uk to find out more about what Music Matters can offer you. And one of the things we can offer you is a whole series of online courses covering lots of different aspects of music. One course is on this very topic of writing chorale harmonizations in the Bach style. But we've got harmony, theory, aural, orchestration, all sorts of things, analysis, you name it, we've got it there. So have a look and see what there might be on there that would be of interest to you. While you're on that website, just click on Maestros on the home page, and that will tell you about our wonderful global community of Music Matters musicians, people all around the world enjoying all sorts of perks of being a maestro, including the opportunity to meet together once a month, where we have a couple of live streams where we study together and we go into much more depth than the kind of thing that we've just been doing. And then composers, arrangers, performers can submit their own work and receive one-to-one feedback and evaluation. And we share all this in the group, and it's wonderfully supportive. Lovely, lovely people, all on a similar musical journey. And lots of people say how much they're on their own with this, and isn't it a wonderful chance to meet with other musicians who are doing the same kind of things and to have a bit of focused feedback. So if that's for you, it's all there at www.mmcourses.co.uk.